Good morning again, and welcome to today's webinar discussing results of a recent survey of tourism and hospitality businesses in Minnesota. I appreciate everyone's attendance today. Hopefully, we'll all learn a little something. I'm Ron Wirtz, Regional Outreach Director at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Before I move into the content portion of the webinar, I have just a few housekeeping items. So today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that the bank does on regional economic conditions. And most of these feature our recent survey work in a variety of fields, including construction, manufacturing, professional services. There's a general business survey, as well as worker experience, and of course, hospitality in Minnesota. There is already a link in the chat box. If you're interested in some of these past webinars or interested in maybe when future ones are coming up, you can go there for a little bit more information. So today's webinar will feature two parts. I will cover the survey results in the first part of this webinar. I hope to go to about 9:25, maybe 9:30 at the very latest. And then after that, the second half will feature a moderated Q&A with myself and two of my partners in this survey, Gretchen Nussbaum of Explore Minnesota Tourism and Angie Whitcomb of Hospitality Minnesota. I will be moderating that Q&A session and would love to get questions from the audience that I can pose to our panelists. So at any point during this event, if you have a question, please post it in the chat box. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. Slides for this presentation and a copy of the video link will be emailed to all registered attendees next week, and we encourage you to share those with others. Lastly, we'd love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation. So we'll have a very, very short 30-second survey just to give us some feedback. We really wish that you would give us that feedback at the end. And so with that, let's turn to some of our content. Before I get started, I have to give you my disclaimer. So the views here, I'm going to tell you a lot of results from this survey. The views that I express here are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. So today's focus is a survey that we did on tourism and hospitality firms in Minnesota. So this is a quarterly survey right now in partnership with, as I mentioned, Explore Minnesota Tourism and Hospitality Minnesota. And this is actually a partnership that established just before the pandemic, kind of serendipitously, actually. And so we've been doing this almost 4 years, and we really have a lot of good historical data on this, some of which I'll be showing you today. This particular survey was conducted in August, kind of the middle of August. We had 273 responses overall. I should note, given the nature of the sampling of firms, we cannot consider this a scientific study, but we do think over time these have been really good snapshots of the industry. So some very quick takeaways. In general, it was a decent summer. There is some modest growth that continues, but I would say demand doesn't seem to be growing like it was in prior summers. There's still a lot of challenges. I think everyone's very familiar with these two things. Inflation and wages are what firms said were really their biggest challenges in terms of being successful. Overall financial health, this is kind of a longer term thing. It's still very positive, but we are seeing some signs that it's maybe eroding just a little bit. And there are some ups and downs in general, but to me, it seems like overall there hasn't been a lot of change or volatility, and I would say that's a good thing. And maybe the sector has found a little bit of its new normal. Not necessarily great for everybody, but again, we're seeing a little bit of stability in the industry. Importantly, the reason we're doing the Q&A at the end is because I want to give my partners an opportunity to give you a little bit of their views on how or what the survey told them. And they'll also be able to offer a little bit more color and nuance given their own opinions on what firms are telling them. So there'll be a lot of data here. I'm going to throw a lot of charts at you and fairly quickly. I wouldn't invest too much time or attention on any single chart. We're going to share this PowerPoint afterwards if you want a little bit closer look. Okay, with that, let's talk about some of the survey results. So revenue is kind of the first thing that we ask about. And first, let me give you a little orientation to how a lot of these charts are set up. So in general, I'm using this bar graph to essentially show different parts of a question. And in general, green means good or growth, red means bad or decline. Okay, so we ask about summer revenue and foot traffic trends in this first question. And overall, what we're seeing is modest revenue growth in terms of the share of firms seeing growth versus decline in revenue. That's the good news. Foot traffic at the bottom bar there, foot traffic has been mostly flat though. And I think part of this is an inflation influence. So consumers are not always spending more as much as businesses are charging more. And that's maybe why revenue is increasing. And I also want to note that, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on this, accommodation in the overall results is weighing down, not weighing down, they are a much larger proportion of the respondents. They're about half. And so what they say tend to reflect the overall, or tend to weight the overall findings a little bit more. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this survey for quite some time. And if you look at recent revenue compared to a year earlier over the 6-month intervals, what this suggests to me, especially if you look at August 2022 and August 2023, is that there is some normalization of the overall revenue trend. Doesn't necessarily mean that normalization is for every firm or even most firms. There's always a lot of volatility in any given quarter or year. And so overall, I think there's, while individual firms might not necessarily be seeing a normalizing trend, I think overall in the sector, there's some evidence of that. So we ask firms to identify a few traits so we can kind of splice the data a little bit, just to get a little bit deeper look. And so we ask them to identify the general region that they are in. And here I would say there's some differences by geography, and some of this is likely influenced by pandemic factors. So you can see that, for example, the metro area performed fairly well. And I think that's in part because they are still, a lot of the firms in the Twin Cities are still in recovery. If you look at the very bottom, the Northeast, I don't want to say perform the worst, but they are seeing revenue trends that were a little bit less positive. I think part of that has to do with the fact that the previous 2 summers had been, I think, really quite strong for many businesses in that area. We also asked them to identify what type of business they were. So there's attraction and entertainment, those that are providing goods and services, and you have restaurants and bars, and then overnight accommodation. And here's where I mentioned earlier, accommodation has roughly half of this responses that we took in. And as you can see here, they saw a little bit less positive a revenue trend. Again, last year, I think, was a fairly strong year for overnight accommodation. And I think they're seeing some slowdown in demand, but their room rates have still actually been quite strong. So again, there's some nuance to some of these results. We ask quarterly questions about revenue, but we also kind of want to get a better idea of how things are going kind of more broadly. So we ask this fairly general question about how things been over the last 6 to 9 months. And here what you can see, how I interpret this question is the 3 bars on the left, the green bars, that's mostly revenue that is, or business activity that's been acceptable or better, kind of positive. And generally what we've seen here is that more than 80% reported good or acceptable business activity so far this year, and then roughly about 18% not so good. That is actually a slight decline over last year. So again, some evidence that maybe there's been a little bit of erosion in terms of some financial conditions, but I would not say that they are negative. So again, same question, but broken down by those two traits that I talked about earlier. First, the regional one. Again, here you see a lot of similarity. You see the central region on the chart on the left. Central businesses from the central part of the state seem to be doing maybe a little bit better than others across, but there's really more similarity here than there is difference. Same with those by business type. You have attraction that I think is probably doing a little bit better, in part because many of those businesses didn't see particularly strong 2021 and 2022. So I think things continue to be growing in that sector. But again, I would say overall, there's still health across all of them. Some are performing a little bit better than others, but it's more on the margins. So let's talk a little bit about challenges. I think these are fairly common and known, to most that are probably watching today. So we asked firms to identify the 2 greatest challenges to their business. And not surprisingly, price inflation is still the #1 problem, and by a large margin. Again, with prices as high as they are, that's challenging at a number of levels. And it did come down a little bit. But the one thing I would also say too here in terms of any changes is that higher interest rates, that's the fourth one down, kind of in the middle. That's the one that saw the biggest increase from February to August. I think we are starting to see as those high rates kind of embed themselves, that more businesses, particularly small firms that are dependent on debt financing, either for operations or capital investments, that they are seeing more negative impact, a bigger challenge because rates are high. In terms of the biggest decline, again, inflation has come down a little bit, wages and supply chain also a little bit. I'm going to talk about the wage thing in a little bit. So we're seeing some improvement in some areas, but I would not call them large. So let's take a little bit closer look at the inflation or price trends. Um, so we ask respondents to talk about not only the prices that they are paying to vendors, the wholesale level, but then also what they are doing, what increases they are passing along to their retail customers. And in general, wholesale price hikes are still quite high. That's unfortunate. I'm going to show you another chart in a little bit, shows it maybe getting a little bit better. If you go to the bottom one, though, that what they're passing on to their retail customers is what you'll see is, and this has been fairly common really throughout the pandemic, is that businesses are not passing all of those wholesale hikes onto their retail customers. Obviously, they're nervous about losing customers if prices continue to go up. So they are doing what they can to try to not pass all of those costs on. In the long run trend, it is improving, but I would only say modestly. And let me give you a chart that explains that a little bit more. So there's so over time, again, we have the wholesale vendor change over on the left and then the retail on the right. And what you see are kind of two patterns. Three, I would say actually. First, has wholesale price increases have been consistently higher over time than retail price changes. The other thing is that on both charts, there is some easing of the overall price increases. That's the second thing I would say. The third thing I would say is they're not falling very fast. So we are seeing some relief in terms of price inflation, but it's not going down probably as fast as anybody likes. So let's talk a little bit about workforce and wage trends. So labor availability has been a big problem, really for some time, really even before the pandemic, if we're going to be honest about it. So if you look at the bars on the very right, those that are saying that labor conditions are very tight, I think the one notable thing of this chart is that it is from August of 2021 to this survey, labor availability is clearly improving. Now, what I would also say is that despite these improvements, labor is still considered very tight. You still have more than 60% that say labor is either very or moderately tight. So it's just better than 60% saying it's very tight and another 20% saying it's moderately. So things are getting better, but I would not call them good. This is a special question and maybe one of the more unique things we learned from this survey. So we know that businesses are having difficulty attracting labor, and we're trying to drill into that not only with this survey but in some of our other surveys as well, trying to figure out what is really getting in the way of finding labor. And we continually hear about housing availability. So we thought we'd ask about it here. This is the first time we've asked this specific question on any of our surveys. And what we found is that more than half of respondents said housing availability has some impact on their ability to find labor. And that's really kind of eye-opening to us, to the Minneapolis Fed, because it really does suggest that labor mobility is not nearly as good as we would hope. 20% said that it had a significantly negative impact. And I think in some sense, I think this industry probably sees a larger impact more than any. It has a lot of kind of medium wage jobs. And if housing is either unavailable or very inexpensive, it's going to affect more of your labor force, given the wage scale, than it might in other areas or for other businesses that maybe pay more. Speaking of paying more, most businesses here really are paying more. I'll give you a couple of different charts relating to wages here, but in general, as we would expect, tighter labor is going to equal higher wages. What I would say is that these wages are coming down modestly. I'll give you a chart on that. So the top chart is what's happened in the past 12 months. And here you see that, close to about 35% are giving increases above 5%. What you see on the bottom chart, so that's we ask, excuse me, we ask firms to tell us, what do you expect going forward? So we know what you did this past year, you told us, what do you think about going forward? And then, kind of the news here is that I think there's some expectation that future wage pressure will ease. I'm going to show you a chart that says that might be possible. We might see some easing of that, but there also might be a little bit of wishful thinking in that. So what you see here again are a couple of different things. So you do see here, so over time, as we've asked this question, you are seeing that if you look from May, the peak in May of last year, down to this one, you are seeing that particularly those that say they are giving the biggest increases above 5% is starting to slowly fall. But I would say it's not falling nearly as fast as what the expected future wage growth is. So if I can just go back to that earlier, there's less than 20% think they're going to give 5% raises in the coming 12 months, but the general pattern has been significantly higher than that. Doesn't mean it can't go there, given economic conditions and other things, but I think there's more likely that it's going to fall somewhere in the middle, that hopefully we continue, at least for business owners purposes, that we continue to see some easing or some relief in that wage pressure, but it might not be as much as people hope. The other thing here is that, as the earlier chart showed, there has been very persistent wage growth, and I think this might be the first time I've showed this particular chart in this webinar series. Is that what you're seeing is that there has been a very stratified move higher in terms of wage levels and the jobs that are out there. So if you look at the two sets of bars to the left, the 10 to 12 and 12 to 15, what's happened essentially is that the share of jobs that are paying less than $15 an hour, excuse me, went from excuse me, went from 38% to 18% in just 2 years. So you really are seeing firm owners respond to labor demands by increasing wages by a significant amount. We also ask, we're not only interested in point in time responses, but we're also really trying to get an idea of what is the trajectory of problems, and whether or not they're getting better or worse. So we asked this question on in a lot of our surveys, and for this particular one, we're interested in kind of whether or not the bigger challenges that you're having in this sector are getting better or worse. And, price of goods, wage pressure, as you can see in this chart, despite the fact that there's some evidence that things are easing, they are still big problems in the views of owners. And I think legitimately, as I mentioned, things might be easing a little bit, but they're not easing very quickly. And owners really don't seem to be feeling that problems are necessarily getting better. Labor availability, a little bit better. That in earlier surveys, I think you'd see the labor availability look a little bit more red. So there's some improvement there, but not net improvement. There's still, again, like I mentioned earlier, labor availability has gotten better, but it's not good. And then you do see the one thing I would note is that supply chain, this time last year, things were, I think, significantly worse. I think we've seen a fairly notable improvement on supply chains getting worked out, and that problem at least not being the one it was. So a few last charts on financial health and outlook. So we ask businesses, revenue is one thing, but there's also just kind of this general financial health. We don't talk about profit, so we want to get a better idea of just how businesses view their current financial health. And again, the two on the left we consider to be positive generally, the two on the right to be less positive for sure. And unfortunately, the share of those that are growing, if you were to compare this to last year's, is that we've seen a notable share fall in terms of those that are actually growing. Part of this might be, again, because we've had some really good summers in terms of activity. So maybe that's part of it. And unfortunately, the share that are on the negative side, both of those saw an increase of about 10%, or 10, each of them, saw a 5 percentage point increase. So we are seeing a little bit of erosion in terms of overall health. this maybe puts it in a little bit better context. So over time, what I would point you to is the very bottom bar is this year's survey. If you go up 4 to August 2022, there you can see that there is a little bit of pullback in terms of how businesses are rating their financial health, a little bit more negative than it was last year at this time. And you see a little bit of erosion kind of with each successive one. Still net positive by a fair margin, but again, it's not necessarily going in the direction we would hope. In terms of looking at it by firm trade, again, from a regional standpoint on the left and a business type on the right, metro businesses, I think, are still in recovery. So their current financial health looks to be a little bit more questionable overall as a group of businesses, a little bit less positive, I guess, probably a better way to say it. Again, because I think a lot of metro businesses are still trying to get back to where they were pre-pandemic, excuse me, because a lot of things related to what's happening in downtown. And then in terms of the business types, for the most part, I would say there's a little bit more similarity here. I don't think it's necessarily unusual to see the food and drink maybe a little bit more volatile. I think that industry tends to see a little bit more turnover in general. And so I don't know over time maybe how that's been changing. I didn't actually look at that over time. And then you have accommodation, despite the fact that their results weren't necessarily of the group, their results overall in terms of revenue growth and things were much flatter. They're actually seeing that their overall health is still pretty decent. And then lastly, just my last data chart, and then just a few last things. The outlook for the remainder of the year, net positive. I think that speaks well for the idea that conditions are still good. I would also point out that the outlook for those that are in the accommodation sector were much flatter, and they're also a very large sample of the overall survey. So all of the other sectors, attraction, allied business, and food drink, were actually much more positive than the overall chart here shows. So a few thoughts, and I kind of characterize this as yes, but. So I think we're still seeing growth, especially for certain kinds of business, but overall growth isn't what it was when we were in the summer last year. Inflation's gotten better, but it's still high. Labor availability also has gotten better, but it's not good. And wage growth is slowing, but it's still high for a lot of businesses. Again, good for workers, not great for business owners. And the overall financial condition is positive. Many more are saying they're okay, but the share of them has been falling a little bit. And the outlook is positive, especially outside of accommodation. So I think there are a lot of positive signs, but obviously we also know that there's lots of challenges out there. In general, I feel like the survey results show that there's some stability. It's kind of hard to predict whether things are going to get a lot better or a lot worse. I would say without some larger catalyst or a big change in the economy, I feel like we've settled into a pattern that has been, I don't want to say predictable, but is not varied a whole lot from over the last several surveys. So excuse me, I really appreciate the opportunity to present these results. So next we're going to go into the Q&A with our survey partners. Again, let me remind you, excuse me, please submit questions via the chat box. And with that, let me stop sharing my screen and let me introduce our two panelists. Our first panelist, Gretchen Nussbaum, she's a research analyst with Explore Minnesota. And that's the state's tourism office for those that may not be familiar. And Angie Whitcomb is the president and CEO of Hospitality Minnesota. She represents the state's lodging, restaurant, and food service and resort and campground sectors. So Gretchen and Angie, thanks for taking the time. First, let me say thanks for just continuing to be great partners in this survey. The Fed finds this a very useful survey. I hope you do as well. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks for being great partners. Okay, so let me start. If it's all right, Gretchen, I'm going to start with you. So I'm curious. So the Minneapolis Fed has a certain perspective on how things are going. I'm curious if the survey results are generally in line with maybe what you were expecting, or if there were any surprises, good or bad. And maybe if you had a chance to maybe drill down a little bit, if you saw anything maybe deeper that I didn't present to folks.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you for the overview. Really appreciate the level of detail you went into and inviting us to be here today. At a high level, I think, how you interpret the results was spot on. We're also seeing that overall, um, the pandemic is not really directly impacting most of the industry, but we've now shifted to this new complex set of operating and financial challenges. They've been having an impact now for a couple of years, and they're really continuing to. So we're seeing that survey after survey. This trend in Minnesota really does fit with some of what we're hearing nationally, and that I think it's right to talk about that we're moving into this new point of stability, or maybe even what we want to call a new normal. But we know within that there is still a lot of excitement nationally for travel, and that we have a lot of opportunity to attract people to Minnesota. So I think from the survey, it's really good to see what's happening at the ground level, and so we can think about these challenges. Pass it over to Angie, but then I do have a few other pieces to throw in, kind of some supplemental data that I think is interesting context for looking at these survey results.
Great. Thank you, Gretchen. And Ron, thanks for having us. Likewise, we appreciate this partnership. So to answer your question, I wasn't necessarily surprised by anything. I was pleased to see that even though it's a slight decline over previous surveys, we're still showing that 80% of our respondents are reporting their business activity acceptable and steadily improving, especially in the metro region. That's what really struck out to me. And to your earlier point, although our members are reporting revenue growth, as I talk to them, they're also reporting fewer tickets or foot traffic, and higher costs. We all know that changed the way consumer spending shows up in our restaurants and our hotels. And in the hospitality industry, especially if your numbers aren't up, they tend to be really down. So I'd rather be celebrating the growth instead of being relieved by stable. But today I will take the relief of stability. One thing I do want to point out is, we're seeing great support of the hospitality businesses statewide, even with the increasing international travel numbers sort of redirecting some of the increases we saw the last couple of years, but especially this summer in Minneapolis. Our hotel market saw periods of significant improvement in bookings and in rates because of an increase of events coming to the area, creating more demand and a buzz of economic activity. So that was really fun to see. And what was even more fun was to see the way our businesses showed up and responded to that. So the more we create that excitement and energy, and then continue to deliver the way that we do here in Minnesota, hopefully we see the trend reverse the growth direction for the next survey.
Right. Gretchen, I'm curious. So you mentioned you had some data to show. Would you like to go on screen and show some additional things?
Well, nothing to screen share, but just kind of
Okay.
some extra points, really speaking to the importance of this industry. We, from the Minnesota Department of Revenue, get various sales and tax numbers. And so we know that this leisure and hospitality is a $16 billion industry. And that for our state generates a lot of tax revenue and over 225,000 jobs. We recently did an economic impact study through tourism economics. And one of the key points coming out of that is that each household in Minnesota would need to be taxed an additional $985 a year to replace the visitor generated taxes that state and local governments receive. So even though we're talking about some challenges, this really is an industry that contributes to our state and everybody who lives here. And then one more side piece, we on a quarterly basis look at travel indicators. And looking at the end of Q2, there were strong signs at the state level for lodging performance, employment, traffic at MSP Airport. Additionally, through U.S. Travel Association, we can see that this year travel spending in Minnesota is up 13% over last year. So even with the mixed information we're seeing, there are reasons also to be optimistic about going forward and growth that's going to continue to occur.
Thanks, Gretchen. Very useful. So let me ask one more question, then I'm going to go to some of our audience members' questions. So I am curious, in 2021 and 2022, we saw some trends kind of form in the sense of high amenity areas saw traffic rebound very quickly. I think the metro, as I talked a little bit during the survey or during the earlier part, have I think, rebounded less quickly. But Angie, I think you correctly mentioned we had the Taylor Swift event, which I think really kind of highlighted that there's some rebound going on. But I'm curious if you could maybe give our audience a little bit of idea of whether or not you think these trends are maybe consolidating again, kind of going back to, regressing to the mean, the pre-pandemic mean, or where do you think both of these separate trends are going right now? Maybe Angie, let's start with you.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing them level out. And I want to point out that's different than a negative decline. To your point, they spiked. And, people were introduced to outdoor experiences because of the pandemic when their favorite urban experience wasn't accessible. People are still spending time in those regions, but we're seeing that increase of people coming back into the metro areas for concerts, events, or even just, some staycations. I think for us, the bigger question mark is what sort of increase, if any, can we expect in the business travel in both areas, outdoor experiences and the urban settings? I mean, we've not seen the levels we had anticipated to see by this point in the recovery. And clearly, we're doing a webinar. So technology has changed the way we do meetings and conferences. And although, the shift, the ease, if you would call it, back into the office at least a few days a week is helping. I think we're still in wait and see on what we can expect from the tourism economy impact of business travel coming back. And I think we've got opportunity and work to do in that area.
Right. Gretchen, any additional thoughts on that?
Agree with Angie. And, I think our perspective at Explore Minnesota is, although we see different patterns in different areas of the state, the important thing really is that there's recovery happening. So even though, summer over summer, it might be different depending upon where you are, overall, the trajectory is where we want it to be. In the metro area, there were some great weekends this summer. Taylor Swift. Around that same time, there were also events with Pride Weekend. The Taste of Minnesota had great attendance despite the heat. The State Fair also had a lot of people come to it. And we're seeing more people at sporting events at the stadiums across the Twin Cities. Also just getting more of that general activity in the downtowns, with some people coming back into the office, staying for a happy hour, taking their family out to a great restaurant. So at the ground level, just hearing those stories, which, really create that excitement for, continuing to have a great fall.
Great. So in the chat box, there have been a number of questions regarding VRBOs, Airbnbs. And I should just let all the audience members know that we don't actually specifically ask about this area of accommodation. So we don't know, we don't have any strong data on this, but I am curious. I know both of you are familiar with what's going on in those spaces. And I'm wondering if you can, maybe give our audience a little bit of some idea of how you think that is impacting accommodation overall, and any other insights you might want to offer on that space. Gretchen, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, we annually do look at what trends are for short-term rentals through data from a company called AirDNA. When it most recently did this, looking back at 22, was actually surprised to see that when we compared the number of rooms for short-term rentals to hotels, only about 2% of the market was short-term rentals that are hotel comparable. About another 8% were short-term rentals, but they're not hotel comparable. They're larger homes where families are going for long weekends and other family gatherings. So, I think that is a little bit different from some areas nationally where there is a much bigger presence of short-term rentals. So first, although of course with the pandemic, there have been more short-term rental listings available, more bookings, it still is a fairly small share. More recently in the data, some of those performance metrics for short-term rentals seem to be flattening, whereas for more traditional accommodations, including hotels, they're improving. So, I think that's kind of what I can say from a research perspective and what we're seeing.
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. Angie?
She nailed it. I mean, those are the statistics are what the statistics are. And I have nothing to add to what Gretchen just answered.
Okay, so I'm gonna take just a second to clarify a couple of questions we got in the chat box about methodology. One is whether or not there's overlap in survey participants, whether or not who exactly we're getting to respond, and can we track individual respondents? The answer there is no. We don't really know how similar each panel is to the next one in terms of individual responses. We do that in part because we guarantee anonymity, and so we don't want to track who exactly is responding. That's something that we maybe would think about in the future, but for right now, what we do think is, give it, as we look at who's responding by region, who's responding by individual business type, we do think that we get a pretty good representation of the same kinds. We get the same kinds of representation, and we're not seeing a lot of volatility in our responses. That we think we're getting a pretty good cross section of the industry, and that's really what we're after. It's maybe not perfect, but if we were to start tracking individual responses, I think we'd see our response rate go down significantly, and so we think that's probably a better way of going about it. There's also someone who asked about whether or not there are customers or respondents from out of state. Angie and Gretchen, my understanding is that your business databases are mostly or all in state. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So yes, so all of our respondents are from Minnesota. One more question. Actually, it looks like we maybe have time for two more. Let me just take a quick peek here. So let me go back to my list. Labor has always been a challenge in this sector, and we are seeing that it's improving a little bit. I'm kind of curious whether or not what you think might be some of the reasons behind that improved labor availability. When you talk to your business contacts, are you hearing that there's just more people applying for jobs, or is it more a matter of maybe they're getting used to a new business model where they're just needing fewer? And we have seen the fact that job openings across the economy have been falling. So there is just a little bit less competition for the available labor that's out. I'm just wondering if you can give me some thoughts on what you've heard from members and just generally in your area of work, how you would describe labor availability right now. Angie, let's start with you.
Great, thanks, Ron, and thanks for the question. The data would show that it is improving. Although as I travel the state, I think what I'm seeing is that our industry has proven once again, it's resourceful and resilient, and they have had to figure out how to do more with less labor. I mean, the data today shows that in our industry, we're still about 10,000 employees shy of where we need to be. And, our survey also showed that businesses are having to pay significantly more to attract and retain. This is showing up in all sorts of different ways, right? So yesterday, for example, I had a member in my office. He happens to be the VP of strategic planning for a large resort ownership group here in the state. And I said, "What's your weekend hold?" And he said, "Oh, I'm heading out to one of our resorts because it's my weekend to strip the beds. It's a big turnover time." So here you have a VP of strategic planning filling a role that can't be filled. And then you factor in that the average hourly rate for workers in our industry is now $20.50 an hour, up $3 an hour from just August of 2020, which might seem like a normal cost of living increase, but businesses, are still, as you mentioned, recovering from the impact of the last 3 years and the higher cost of goods and services, inflation, slower rebound in some areas, and it's just having a significant impact on the labor piece. And so I don't know that it's improving as much as they've found a way to deal with it.
Gretchen, anything to offer additional on that?
What Angie said and what you've said makes a lot of sense. I guess kind of the add-on piece from Explore Minnesota would be that we are working with Senator Klobuchar's office and her work at the national level to promote labor from abroad. So a big piece of that is looking at visa processing and really improving the speed of that and streamlining the experience for visitors, but also workers who are especially important during that summer season. So that's an area where we're, honing in to see how our support can help move it forward.
Great. So, I mentioned in one of the charts on the challenges that the share that are seeing interest rates be a problem has grown. It's still a fairly small number, but has grown. And I think as a Federal Reserve, I think we need to acknowledge that the Fed's aggressive approach to reining in inflation, it affects real businesses. And I think I'd be remiss not to ask, how are you seeing higher interest rates play out, especially among small businesses that tend to depend a little bit more on financing for either operations or capital investments. I'm wondering if you can give me a little idea on what your members and what your business contacts are telling you about the effects of higher interest rates.
I can jump in here.
Sure.
One of the things I saw this summer, especially in the resorts portion of my membership, they're wanting to make investments or capital, like repairs to their property or make investments and expand. And the high interest rates paired with the increased cost of the labor to do the work make the economics of that really difficult, if not impossible right now. And as I think about that scenario for our members, delaying this until, a year from now, maybe when rates are down, and we're tracking like, well, how's your revenue growth? I mean, like, is it ever going to get to a point where they can make those investments? Mm-hmm. Probably a more concerning area that we're looking at is, higher borrowing costs creating a barrier to entry, especially for entrepreneurs, the small businesses in the restaurant, area where they're already working on, really thin margins. High interest rates could push future operators away. And we're really trying to focus on that next generation of owners and operators. So then you pair all that, Ron, with, increasing property tax, rising insurance costs, all of the, operating costs that are expanding. It's a burden that makes it impossible for many to even consider borrowing money right now.
Right. Gretchen, anything to add?
Nothing new.
Okay, so we just got I think this will be our last question. It's a really interesting one from Peter. It says, do you get a sense that tourism is increasing for environmental reasons? Are we seeing any additional traffic from southern states or other places that might be looking at a move to Minnesota just for environmental reasons, and given some of the heat waves we've seen and things of that nature? I'm just kind of curious question. Angie, let me start with you.
I'm going to kick it to Gretchen, Ron.
Oh, okay, great. Gretchen?
Yeah, I'm actually have some interesting information on that one. This year, Explore Minnesota focused on 2 flight markets that were kind of outside of the immediate region for marketing, of Atlanta and Dallas. And particularly in Dallas, saw strong results. So it's pretty easy for people to get on 35, drive north, come to Minnesota where it is cooler. So that is something we have been picking up on as a trend in the past couple of years. The state of Minnesota is also beyond visitation, looking at livability of our state. And there are anecdotal stories out there about how people, might not want to be in California where the forest fires are, and how Minnesota offers some reprieve from some of the natural disasters that are becoming more common. So it is something that we're thinking about, and we're seeing people have an interest in our state for. And I think, it's something that will continue to become even more important in the coming years.
Yep. So I'm going to add one little anecdote to this, and note that it's an anecdote and not a trend for sure. But I happen to be up in Duluth, and this was I believe late last year, and I happened to be at a restaurant, and I was by myself, and I happened to sit next to a couple, and we started chit-chatting, and they happened to be from Arizona, and they were specifically looking at Minnesota and the northern part of Minnesota and Wisconsin, because they were seeing problems in terms of water accessibility where they lived in Arizona, and were just kind of kicking the tires. So again, anecdote only, not trend, but I was struck by the fact that I had never heard or talked to anybody thinking about that kind of reverse migration. So whether or not it continues, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I want to thank you, Gretchen. Thank you, Angie, for coming on today. Thank you to everybody that came today. I appreciate it. Hope you learned something. I think we all have. And I just want to thank everybody, and a reminder that as you exit out, there's that little survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this. We wish you all a very great day. Thanks much.